Hi, I'm John Landis. Welcome to episode 4. For the next few episodes, we're going to cover the topic of joinery. Every piece has got it, and chances are what you're working on now has introduced you to joinery you're not so sure of. So we'll start easy, move on to more difficult joints as we move on through the episodes. Thanks for joining me. Hi, welcome to our first episode on joinery. We're going to cover the basic joint first, and then we're going to move on to more complicated joints. I've actually pulled a bedside table of ours up to show you, because the chairs that we're working on in the shop have a limited number of joints. They're mortise and tenon joints and slip joints, and that's about it for a chair. So I pulled this piece in mainly to show you that a piece like this, a carcass piece, has a lot of different joints in it, and you need to decide which joint is appropriate for which application. So a piece like this uses a mortise and tenon joint to attach an apron to a leg. It uses edge gluing or an edge joint to make a smaller piece of wood into a larger panel. It also uses edge joining to make a top, joining 3 pieces of wood to make a top. We also have dovetail joints to make drawers, and up here for that apron we have a drop-down dovetail joint. So I'm going to pull a piece like this in to show you different joints. But the first one we're going to do is an edge joint. And an edge joint is used when we're trying to make a narrow board or a thin board wider. Not that in particular board, but gluing boards together in order to make a wider panel, for example, for a side like this, or a wider board to make a top like this. It's a basic joint, but it's one you need to know how to do properly. You also need to know under what circumstances to do it. So we'll cover that one first. So really, the first thing to consider is under what circumstance. Why would you need to edge glue boards together? Well, the real simple answer is you want to take a single board that may be 6, 7, or 8 inches wide and glue it to another one, or another one, or another one in order to make a wider board. Common application for that would be tabletops, would be bedside tabletops like the bedside table I just showed you. You might do it to make a side panel in a carcass, a piece of carcass work. You may, under some circumstances, if you happen to need to have a wide face on a drawer and you've only got, say, 6-inch stock and you really need a 9-inch drawer, you're going to need to edge glue 2 pieces together in order to get a single board that's wide enough to accomplish that drawer. So the most common application will be a tabletop or a carcass top, but chances are what you're working on might be a console table, might be a bedside table, you might be ambitious and be doing a dining table. But whatever the circumstance is, we're taking narrower boards, gluing them to another narrower board or a series of narrow boards and making these bigger. Now I taught you back in episode 1 or 2, or I don't know which one, that you can glue long grain together. Remember that this is the long grain of the board, these are the 4 long grain sides, this is the end grain. We cannot glue end grain to end grain, but we can glue long grain to long grain. And it makes an incredibly strong joint. So if we took these 2 pieces together that have nice straight edges and glued them together, this board becomes and takes on the characteristics of one single board. And by the characteristics I mean it will shrink and expand the same amount that, say, a 14-inch board would shrink and expand as it would 2 7-inch boards. So it's going to take on those characteristics. Now a lot of people ask me what joint I use here. And it confuses me because, well, the joint is an edge joint. You're gluing 2 edges together. I think that the reason they're asking is they think that that joint is not enough. A lot of common ideas are that you need biscuits in there, and that biscuits are the joint. Well, not only do you not need biscuits, but they can sort of cause problems for you. You don't need biscuits because these edges glued together are incredibly strong, and in fact, stronger than the wood itself. I told you in a past episode that if you glued these two boards together and then stood on them, these boards would break first somewhere in the wood before they would break on the glue joint. It's a stronger joint. Adding a biscuit makes an already strong joint stronger, I guess, but you don't need it to be stronger. And I wouldn't use it because it can actually cause you problems. It can cause you alignment problems where you can't get these two equal boards lined up nice and flat on the face. It can also do something called they're called ghosts. And what that means is you've put a biscuit in here on this edge joint with glue, and let's say you go back 10, 12 hours later and you sand these faces nice and flush and you're working along. Well, the glue that's in the biscuit joint is continuing to dry. It continues to release its moisture. That's how the glue works. And so that pocket of biscuit and glue will actually shrink. And you'll find after you've put finish on that you'll actually be able to see where the biscuits are through the face of the board because of that shrinking. It creates a different plane. So my answer is don't use biscuits. You don't need them. They only cause problems. So this joint is incredibly strong. Go with just this joint. Now the success or failure of this joint actually depends on how good your edge joint is. And by good, I mean it needs to be perfectly straight, perfectly flat, and perfectly square to the face. Now if you have a jointer, then that all obviously relies on you having a nice square fence on the jointer, that your blades are sharp, and that you've actually put a nice joint into the wood. Any bow, any cup is going to create tension as you're clamping those edges together, and you don't want tension in the board. So after you've shot that edge, you want to hold it up to the light and make sure that the two edges you're using are really nice and snug. You don't see any light through it. A tiny bit of light is going to be okay, but if you have major gaps, you need to rejoint that edge. If you don't have a jointer, we've covered this before as well, it's perfectly fine for you to use a jointer plane. Now typically a jointer plane is considered a number 6 or above, a 6, 7, or 8. And the reason that is because they act like a jointer. They have a long bed. So what this does is carries the blade over the valleys and cuts off the peaks, if you will, of the joint. The shorter it is, the plane would actually be riding in there and you wouldn't accomplish a good straight joint. So if you need to joint this with a hand plane, use a 6, a 7, or an 8. An 8 is a monster plane. 6 is pretty manageable, and 7s are good ones as well. One trick I would like to cover, if you're using a 6, a 7, or 8 jointer plane, is once you've figured out your layout, how you're going to glue these boards together. Now these are really small for demonstration purposes. You're not going to sit here and glue up 3-inch boards to make a wide panel, but they're for demonstration. Is once you've decided what your layout is going to be, and you need to joint these edges nice and clean. If you take these two boards here and fold them on each other, and then hold this edge as straight as you can, as equal as you can, and put that into a vise. When you run your hand plane over this edge to create a nice joint, it does two things. One, it gives you a wider surface to plane off. A little 3/4 inch surface could probably cause some rock in the plane that you're using, and you're not going to get a great result. So one thing putting two together does for you is gives you a wider base, and you obviously don't want to be wider than your hand plane is, but it gives you a wider base and a more stable base to push the hand plane through. The other cool trick is, if you're jointing this edge and you put a little pressure on the outside of the hand plane or the inside of the hand plane, whatever's your technique, and you put a little bit, I'm going to exaggerate so you can see, you put a little bit of an edge on here, it's actually okay because the edge that you're taking more off of on this board and less off on this board actually equals out once you fold the board back up. So if you folded these down face to face and we've taken off an angle like this, this is a short lower edge and this is a higher edge. When you fold those two together back up like this, the joint that you create is actually going to keep a nice flat face on this. So it's a nice little trick. So it does two things. It gives you stability, but also gives you a better, more proper joint. So I hope you've learned a little bit about edge gluing, edge jointing, putting boards together to make tabletops. It's really the easiest joint to do but you can blow it. So take your time, be careful, make sure that your joint is really nice. Even if it's on the jointer, make sure it's a beautiful joint. If it's done with a hand plane, take the time to make that joint really nice. Go ahead and glue those boards together and then treat it like it's a board as wide as it is. You'll have a lot of success. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you in the next one.